Welcome to Cyber Survivor. I'm your host, Dan Dodson. And for over 2 decades, our guest has been at the intersection of cybersecurity and technology. I'm very excited to welcome the founder and CEO of Aweccom, Brent Yax. Brent, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So excited to talk with you today and learn from each other. Before we dive in, just give me a little bit of background. What got you interested in IT and cybersecurity?
Sure. So really, it was something that I fell into. I didn't have a motivation, in high school to go one different direction. In college, I wasn't really sure where I was going. And, I just sort of always had this technical nature about me and always got involved in that. So, flash forward 30 years and I'm still doing it. And we've had a lot of success in, Aweccom in the network, management side, the technology management side, and the cyber management side. So really it's kind of a roller coaster, but it's fun.
And is it true that you guys started out mainly on the IT side and networking side and then kind of evolved into cybersecurity? Is that a fair way to think about it?
We did. Even before that, so go back, 26 years, and we were providing internet lines to people. And we built data centers and we stored, we did what's called ping power pipe, right? Just getting access to systems. And then that evolved over time into IT management, which now has to be cyber too. So.
Yeah, that's right. And when did you start really seeing the transition where, managing IT started to more fully encompass cybersecurity? Like, how long ago did you see that transition start?
Well, we used to describe cybersecurity as sort of this, it was more sort of like bullies out there that were trying to hack. They were trying to do the, like, I love you virus, like all these little things that were more to see if they could do it. Well, there was this transition that happened maybe 8-9 years ago where, we saw this new cyber economy being built and all these nefarious actors coming and looking to exploit for capital gain. And once that started, we really realized we're going to have to take this a bit more seriously, do some education, do some cyber prevention. And then about 5 years ago, we actually rolled out a very large suite of cyber services to make sure that we protect our clients from it. And again, it's been accelerating since then.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, we're obviously primarily in healthcare, and so it's kind of the vantage point that I look at things through most of the time. But the adversaries have increased their tactics and are coming after us. And you mentioned something that's real important to understand for the audience, which is, they're there for monetary gain, right? And so the adversarial intent is to come in and disrupt operations so that they can extract money in some form or fashion out of it. How have you seen that impact your business as you think about serving clients?
I mean, obviously, it's something we have to focus on all the time, right? So we no longer have it as an option. Cybersecurity is something that's baked into everything that we do because, you used to stay under the radar. Maybe the small mid-market wasn't focused on it as much because they thought nobody's targeting us. Well, that's not the reality of the situation. Actually, small mid-market is targeted quite extensively. They just don't realize it because they control 65% of payroll. So they're really being hit hard. So we changed our product to really push those services and to really make sure that people are protected. And, right now what we're trying to focus on is just education, because although you put all the protection in place, the weakest link is still generally users. So you're trying to educate and reinforce some of those security tools you have.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think we've made progress on education? I mean, every guest that I talk to, all the clients I talk to, I mean, it's like education. The number one attack vector is through the humans, whether that's a help desk or an individual. Like, how do you think we've made progress on that? Haven't we?
Great question. I think at a bare minimum, at least, we have increased awareness that, this is a vector that people are using. I do think that when we started these services and we started talking about cyber awareness training, there was a lot of, this doesn't affect me. It's not something that I have to worry about. Nobody's targeting me. And now we're getting into sort of an acceptance realm where people are saying, okay, I get it. I understand why this is important. Maybe I am sort of a target because it's really just either exploiting data or trying to get payroll or trying to get a wire transfer, whatever the solution is that they're trying to get money from. So people realize, hey, I'm a part of this and I need to be aware of what's going on and I need to do a little bit more due diligence. So we're seeing that, which is a good trend.
Yeah, certainly. I think everybody across the U.S. has certainly had or received the letter that their information has been compromised at some organization. I mean, do you think we're kind of, from a society perspective, getting numb to that? I mean, it seems like every month I'm getting one of those.
Yeah, they're everywhere. It would be hard at this point not to have seen that, right? Because,
Right.
your bank or your credit card or your fast food place or whatever it is, somebody has been affected and they've sent those communications out. So, but the good news about that is that we're aware and we're taking this a little bit more serious. The bad news, to your point, is exactly we're being desensitized to it. And it's like, oh, so my data was stolen again. What am I going to do about it? It keeps happening. And so we've even seen a drop off of people that are attending sort of our workshops on cyber because it's just a conversation piece that's absolutely everywhere now. And they're losing sort of that fear that they had, a year or two ago.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think when those letters first, started coming out everywhere at kind of scale, if you will, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago, people were super nervous, and there's a lot of conversations about what does this mean, and I think there is a level of reality that people are desensitized to it. But on the business side, though, it can be pretty disruptive to the business side, right? When you think about operating a business or executing, care in communities in the healthcare realm, how have you seen organizations think about this a little bit differently as they thought about business disruption, operations, revenue, those types of things?
Yeah, so they're taking a lot more of a proactive look at it. So what I've seen and what we've talked to people about is not necessarily, if something happens, but it's more kind of when something happens. And then in that situation, how do you react? What is what we call an IRP, an incident response plan? What do you have in place to go from here's an issue to here's how we're serving our clients? And, take for an example, something that happened fairly recently locally here in Michigan was that a whole school district got hit and got shut down. And I'm not going to mention names, but it took out 8,400 students couldn't go to school for 3 days because their network systems were taken down. And what was either some maybe problem internally, but they kind of said it was maybe a cyber incident that they're looking into. And that's devastating. So that's a school, but imagine if you're a business and, take in Michigan, if you're a supplier to an automotive company and you're down for 3 days, well, they penalize you for that. So not only is there a reputation damage, there's financial monetary damage, and then there's also credibility damage, right? So you're not going to get those big contracts anymore if you don't fix those. So we're seeing a proactive response, and people are, what happens if everything hits the fan? How do I get back in operating and how fast can I make that process? And that's what they're focused on.
Yeah. How do I limit the impact, right? I think what you said is spot on. I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so how do we make sure that we're prepared? We have resiliency. We can limit the blast radius within the environment and then sustain operations and limit the damage that we have. Again, whether that's, producing something in the manufacturing realm or, delivering care in a community or educating people. And one of the things I often think about, and I'd love your view on this, but what are some of the second and third level impacts? Like, take the example you gave. So school shut down, but where are the kids going to go, right? The parents are working, right? Like, there's a lot of impacts to businesses that aren't even in the blast radius, so to speak, of the cyber event. I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, and that hits home too for me because I have 2 kids, right, that are in school, and I know that if something happened, their school is shut down, that changes my entire week. I'm bumping meetings, I'm canceling things. It changes everything. So in the business world, I mean, that's the exact same thing, right? It's not even like maybe a family side of it, right? We're not talking about if business is shut down, then I have to go home and that disrupts the family. But what about the businesses that it's rippling out to? So, in the example of an automotive manufacturing supplier, right? If you stop the production line in a business, that's devastating, right? So all of the people that all the clients from one of the big automotive manufacturers aren't getting their things on time, and now they're delaying that, and now they're renting cars, and now there's a huge ripple effect that's happened with all these events. And then think about also if it's data. So now if data is taken, well, now you're getting some credit monitoring, or now, maybe somebody's data is being used and now they have years of cleanup that they have to do because this data has been used somehow. That's a big thing in healthcare where they're just using their accounts to run up these charges. Once that identity is stolen, that takes forever to fix. And you have a huge liability hanging over your head while you're trying to fix that. So the rippling effect of these is monstrous.
Yeah, absolutely. And you work in multiple different verticals. How do you see the different verticals as far as how they think about cybersecurity? I mean, is there a lot of difference in the level of prioritization that you see in service area X versus Y? I mean, or is it across the board? I mean, what do you think about that, or how do you experience that?
There is. And, I wish really everybody would take it as serious as some industries do. But there's a couple things that drive that, right? There's from just a consumer and business standpoint, there are industries that have much more sensitive data. So a financial institution would, a healthcare institution would. So there are ones that just by nature of what they do, they are obligated to, protect the consumer data from a trust standpoint. Somebody doesn't want to put their credit card somewhere or put their social security number somewhere, not knowing that you have that protection. Then there's also the regulatory component, right? So if you're, like I said, in a financial institution, a health institution, or you're doing business with like European Union or California, there are these regulatory frameworks that you have to adhere to. So those things drive the, industries that have a bigger focus. And then some of the smaller and some of the unregulated ones and some of the ones without consumer data are taking a little bit more of a we'll see if it happens to someone I know approach, where they're doing sort of what they have to get liability coverage from a cyber liability policy, and then that's it. So there is a broad range, and it usually has to do with the sensitivity of that data that they have.
That's kind of what I expected. Do you see that mindset shift at an organizational level if they experience a cyber breach? I mean, they kind of reimagine their prioritization if something happens to them. Is that a fair way to think about it?
In a perfect world, that would be the case. So yes, there are some companies that get hit unexpectedly and suffer some loss, and they say, okay, going forward, we really have to, adjust and take this seriously. Now, in a smaller entity, that's hard because that loss usually means a financial loss. So now the budget to invest isn't really there as well as it could have been. So there's that real world constraint that happens. But when you look at some of these large entities that have been hit, there's an entire site out there on the dark web that is a list of people that have been attacked successfully, what the exploit was, and that, hey, it's been 6 months and they haven't fixed it yet. And it's just a free for all. It's called a wall of shame, similar to what we have here on the media in Detroit, where they call it the wall of shame. But it's about businesses that haven't fixed their exploits so that new hackers can just get in every 6 months and take advantage of them. So I would say I would love it if they did fix it and it really shook some, but it doesn't always. And that's a pretty big risk for them.
Yeah, no, that's it. That's always the challenge, right? Is that if you're in a situation where you're down, you have financial impacts, and then how do you prioritize the budget to make sure that if you do deploy capital, if you have it, to prevent it in the future. So the recovery stage is, to your point, kind of long and tedious and challenging sometimes financially. Shifting to a positive light, I mean, what progress have you seen the different industries or areas make over the last couple of years?
On a positive side, even though I'm not one to jump out and, be an insurance salesman, I do think that we've finally seen some catch up happening in the cyber liability policies and coverage. They're forcing, better tools. They're saying that, look, if you don't get together and get some of these fundamentals done, like multi-factor authentication, or maybe EDR or MDR, which are just how do you protect your endpoints really, really well, zero trust things that they're pushing, like all of these advancements they're kind of forcing in policies, that is really moving the market forward. So what I mean by that is that clients are being put in a situation where they either have to get on board or they're losing coverage that is very important to them. I hate that kind of work where you have to force somebody to move forward, but it is helping quite a bit. And another thing that I think is very positive is just the acceptance of training has really skyrocketed over the last few years. We would have clients before that had never had security awareness training. We would come in and say, when was the last time? And they'll say, what is that? So, now when we go in and clients and we say, well, when was the last time you had cyber awareness training? They're saying, oh, we did that earlier this year. So that's a great positive move forward for the industry. And I do think that we're finally shaking the US to come with some policies. We don't really have any legislation around this. We have the things that are illegal, the old acts, right? And they've always been illegal and they always will be illegal. But we don't have any policies that enforce foreign entities from preventing them from doing, harm to U.S. companies. We're starting to see the needle shift a tiny bit, and I'm hoping that gets addressed. And that's a big missing piece that we have right now.
Yeah, I think sometimes regulation or pressure from insurance companies, et cetera, can be a driving force behind that. One of the things I always get a little bit concerned about as it relates to cyber insurance is, as you're familiar with, you fill out the application, you make an attestation, it gets underwritten, call that on day zero, you now have a policy that's in force. Then your environment changes over the next couple of months while the policy's in force. Boom, you have an event, and then they're like, oh, are you doing what you said you were going to do? And the environment changed and you lost sight of it. And then do you really have the coverage that you thought you had? How have you seen that play out? Or have you seen any challenges in that area?
Yeah, and even more so on that. So the policy itself, right? You need to make sure you're working with a reputable firm. We don't sell insurance, but we do work with a few that we've found to be very good to go back and forth with on some of those changes in the network. Because you're right, when you change something within that network or the security posture of the organization, you now have an issue potentially with a gap in that coverage. So that definitely needs to be addressed. One of the other things that we've seen, which is kind of a gotcha too, is that some of the insurance providers out there from a liability standpoint, and put it in perspective, they lost a lot of money last year. They've struggled with figuring out how to write policies and do this protection because of this hockey stick that's happened in cyber activity. And they keep kind of betting a little off and losing a little. So they're trying to cover themselves, right? But they'll word things in such an ambiguous way or such an open-ended question that the way you answer that could actually void that contract going forward. So you need to work with the liability companies that are pretty open and honest and explain what they mean by this and help you understand how to answer those questions, because there's some out there that are just limiting their exposure by making it confusing. And that's putting companies at a big risk that they don't know they're in right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. I mean, get a good broker to work with, make sure that you're having a consistent conversation. There's organizations out there that, compliance or maybe even the office of the CFO will be working on the insurance, and then nobody in IT or cyber is none the wiser. And then there's this big gap between reality. And if an unfortunate event happens, hopefully it doesn't, you don't want to find yourself in a situation where you actually don't have the coverage you think you have.
I think that's more common than people think, especially in the mid to large size organizations where there's that disconnect between our compliance and governance like committees and insurance, groups, and who's doing what work and how they're changing the network. And we got to bridge that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a very strong recommendation. What other recommendations do you think about as you think about building resiliency in your client bases? What are some of the areas that you'd like to focus on?
Yeah, so, first and foremost, we really do some readiness assessments on where the organization is from a security posture. There's a few avenues, right? There's the technology itself there that you need to make sure you have at least the bare minimum tools in. So we got to get up to that baseline of the bare minimum security tools. Then there is the policies and processes that people are following. So let's examine some of the processes, how you're doing things. For an example, if somebody calls and says, hey, I'm the CEO and can you please send me this wire? What are the processes you're going through and the steps you're going through to verify that? Or when you're getting, say, a financial transaction document that says, here's where you're wiring, what you're doing, so what are your steps to verify that information is accurate? So there's policy and process. And then there's also cultural impact and readiness. So that's where the training comes in. That's where you have, if, for example, a culture is adverse to change because it keeps happening and they keep having new systems and they keep doing things, they're going to reject the changes on the security side because they don't want a longer password. They don't want to reset it again. They don't want to use MFA and do this twice now instead of once. They're so adverse to change at this point, your adoption is going to disappear. And none of these things are good without a policy people know, a process they follow in adopting technology. If you don't do those things, everything fails. So that's what we're working on now is the cultural impact and how do we manage cyber in its entirety.
No, I love that. And I think about that all the time, that if we're going to increase our cybersecurity posture at any organization, and we also understand that humans are the weakest link, then you got to build that culture. And it starts at the top, and it's the C-suite. I see so many times that there's training and awareness programs, but we're going to exclude the C-suite, or we're going to exclude this side of the organization because the manager, he or she doesn't, want to play nice. To your point, they're going through a bunch of other crap. We'll get them later. Well, the problem is later never happens, right? And so you never end up actually getting there. And so it starts with a culture and a mindset, I think, that starts at the top. That's really important from a protection perspective.
Yeah, that's scary too, because you're right. That C-level exception that happens, right, where they're like, I don't want to bother this person. They're so important, and I don't want them to, have to jump through these hoops. They're the ones with the most access. Man, if somebody gets them, the company's done. Like if somebody gets the intern who doesn't have access to anything, it's not nearly as impactful.
Yeah.
They get the COO, and they have every single file.
That's right. And the other thing too is it's like we're seeing a lot of attacks coming through help desks, right? Whether that's like a big help desk or you're a small organization, you've got one person there that may have multiple hats. That the adversaries know that they can bully them by representing themselves as some member of the C-suite, because there's culture pressure maybe that I don't want to push back against the C-suite. I don't want to say no to this person that is very powerful, and so the adversaries know that. So putting those controls in place and being accepting of those controls at the highest level, I think, is really important and oftentimes missed.
Yeah. And I don't think people understand how sophisticated these are getting. So there is an ecosystem that exists out there in this cyber community, and it is so broken apart by function. So there's groups out there that all they do is find exploits and ways into places. There are groups out there that just monitor and collect information and sell it. There are groups that then go and buy from those two groups to say, well, I'm going to actually do an attack that gets me money. And these ecosystems exist where you could have already been targeted a long time ago by just a person who's exploiting a vulnerability, and your name's on a list, and they're just waiting for a bidder to come buy it to take advantage of you. So I don't think people realize that this can get very dangerous very quickly. And if you haven't been hit, it doesn't mean you haven't been exploited. It means the second group hasn't come in yet. And we're also seeing now fighting groups where they could come in and encrypt all of your data for, like, say, a ransomware attack, and then before you pay, another one comes in and encrypts that. So they have to get paid first before the second group can get paid. So avoiding these things or creating some system to restore without paying is paramount, that you need to really focus on today.
I'm so glad you brought that up. We had another guest on that talked a lot about ransomware and how that works, and he talked about the kind of makeup of these ecosystems, as you called it, for the adversaries. And you're right, it's no longer one person in a hoodie in their basement, although that does happen, not as prevalent clearly. But these are complex networks, right, where there are discrete centers of excellence in different areas of the attack chain, as sad as it is. And so you're absolutely right. Understanding that dynamic and preparing yourself is critically important, without a doubt. Have you seen the landscape change at the C-suite? We talk a lot about on this podcast about the culture element you talked about, and like cybersecurity, call it 5-10 years ago, was an IT problem, right? And now it's like, man, this is everybody's problem, right? And we need cyber to be a part of every initiative, and not the last part at the end where we just like, oh, hey, make sure this is okay or secure, right? I mean, how have you seen that change over the last 10 years?
I think there's just an acceptance of accountability there. So what I mean by that is that historically speaking, maybe 6-7 years ago, we would have a conversation around cyber and, what we need to do to get you into a position of elevated security. And you would get a little bit of a pushback because we just don't see this out there all the time. I'm not seeing it happen. It's not something where my board's going to come to me and say, oh my gosh, you should have had this in place years ago. And, therefore you're accountable for, this breach. Well, today now that accountability has really shifted back onto that C-suite. Whereas the board will come back and say, it is obvious security is an issue out there and you did not do anything about it. This is your fault. And because of that, just where that lands today and who's responsible for that, we've seen more adoption. We've seen less pushback. In fact, an example of this would be, we decided as an organization for all of our IT clients that we are going to make these things mandatory. And it was about 4 different cybersecurity elements that were pretty advanced at the time. Now, hopefully, they're becoming normal. But we made it mandatory throughout an entire client base without any exception. In fact, the only exception was if you decide we don't want to go down this path, that's totally fine, but you can't be a client here because we can't risk you. And we're in charge of putting this together and making you safe. And this is how to do it. And if you can't do it, then we can't do our job. Zero pushback from any client whatsoever. All of them adopted all of the practices. So we couldn't have done that 5 years ago. It just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. I think that the other thing that I always encourage, I guess colleagues in the cyberspace is it's also incumbent upon us to make sure that when an organization is accepting risk, we're talking with the business, we're talking with the C-suite, right? Like as IT and cyber leaders, we don't need to be the ones that accept the risk. We need to work with the business to make sure that they understand where those risk points are, to try to gain that alignment and be farther, and more aligned.
Yeah, I think if there's one recommendation for sort of the cyber teams out there and the crews out there is, get your get some business classes in, because the conversation you have to bring up to the C-suite in real terms that they understand, from business risk mitigation, downtime, all of these things that impact the ability for that business to be successful. Because if it's a technical conversation, I can pretty much promise you the C-suite's not going to come down to that level and understand it. And what they're going to do is make a decision that doesn't seem consistent with the risk you're trying to speak about. But it's because they don't understand the conversation. When they understand the risk, they usually make the decisions that are best for the company based on that risk. And you just got to get to that level of communication where you both are speaking the same words and terms.
I think that's very well said. It's a huge challenge for cyber professionals to be able to frame up risk in the same context that other risk is framed up on. And what I always say is, like, look, to your point, these C-suite folks, they know how to look at financial risk or operational risk or clinical risk in a healthcare environment. They're used to thinking through risk. So we got to figure out, how do we frame cyber in the same context that they're used to receiving information. And I think you're absolutely right that when we do that successfully, typically we get the results that we want, which is a more protected organization or more funding or whatever you need to push your initiative forward. So let's shift to the topic of AI before we wrap up. I mean, we can't be on a podcast in 2025 and not talk about AI. So how are you thinking about AI for your clients or for your business as it relates to cyber?
Yeah, I was going to say there's a couple areas. There's AI in terms of just business and productivity and efficiency and all those things. But in terms of cyber, we're looking at it as a better way to understand a real-time complex set of risks for either some remediation action, some preventative action, or some notification action. So either the tools that we're using, they're, say, for example, simple email filtering verification, spam prevention, advanced threat protection on an email surface. The AI tools are better at understanding the industry, because every industry has different types of attack vectors. They're getting very good at understanding the ways in which people are talking. So a CEO may talk in this way to the team members or may talk in that way to the team members. And they're very good at realizing when something goes askew in that. And they're starting to build these customized, personalized rules on some of those attacks. That's a great area that we've seen it in. We're also seeing it in, just the overall landscape and security posture of a company. And when something new changes, when the patches are changing, when you're just doing normal maintenance and updates, you open up vulnerabilities that you may not have known about, because it's so hard to manage 75 different platforms and software packages and update versions and all these. It's hard for the MDRs and EDRs too as well. So we're seeing the AI tools just get a better look at instantaneous. When this change happens, let me find what's going on and let me report back to you on what that new risk you just did that you don't know about is. So there's a ton of advancement there that's helping, just in that prediction side or that alert side or remediation side. And those are the three areas we're focused on.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. How do you think about advising clients about using AI inside their business operations? And how does that potentially open them up for more vulnerability?
Yeah, so it comes down to, I think, with AI is data and data risk, right? So how do you get an organization to move up the scale from a readiness standpoint, which means culturally they're ready, from a leadership standpoint they're ready, from an infrastructure standpoint they're ready, from a data standpoint, protection they're ready. And what we're doing is just courses, just training, going in there and exposing the risk. There's a huge data protection risk if you're just taking stuff from inside the company and put it into these AI systems without having any idea of where it's going. And the real big risk, and I talk about too, is that people are doing it because they say, well, the terms and conditions of, say, one of these large LLMs, it says that they're not going to share data. And I remind them, you're in a free version. They can change anything at any time. They can use that data tomorrow. We've just seen one big one change from opt-in to opt-out of sharing data. This happens. So just understanding what terms and conditions are, understanding our data protection policy, understanding what can leave the building and what can't, understanding if they're HIPAA compliant, what that means, and you can't take that data and put it into ChatGPT. Those things. It's education, and it's really just readiness and preparedness for them.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that leaving it unaddressed at the organizational level is a big mistake, because if you think your associates are not using the publicly available ChatGPTs or Bronx or whichever their favorite AI platform is, if you leave it unaddressed, they're probably using it. The reality is, like, because they're using it in their daily lives. I always think about, like, in healthcare, most physicians know that they're not supposed to text in their normal text applications their physician colleagues. The reality is they do that all the time. They phone a friend via text messaging all the time with complex cases, despite for the last 15 years we've been educating them not to do that. The same thing applies, I think, at the business level. It's certainly something that makes me nervous even in my business, right? I mean, we have policies and we have controls and we don't allow it and all that, those types of things. But it's a scary world out there, because you could get some very sensitive, confidential information out there in those LLMs. And then, to your point, if you're in the free version, man, you don't know what's happening.
Yeah, there's this evolution, right? And we talked a little bit about the cultural impact of cyber and how do you get the teams to really follow some of those policies. Well, it really goes from, we think that, or we don't have any policies in place at all. And then it goes through this lifeline of, like, we've rolled the policies out, we've educated people on the policies. And then you get into the more mature levels where people understand the why behind the policy, which is really impactful, because if you're ever going to get to what you consider yourself a security focused company, which just means that we know the why, we know why it's here, we know why it's really important that we have to follow it. Then you get people actually following the policies. And that goes with data, that goes with cyber, that goes with anything internally. You got to go up that spectrum of maturity to people get it. They understand it and they feel it. And that's part of who they are.
Completely agree. It's no different than any type of change management, right? You want people to buy in and understand the why. Any tips and tricks you have for people to help educate their staff so that they understand the why?
Yeah, so the cyber is a little bit of a different ball game than, say, I'm changing our internal line of business application, right? I'm changing my EMR, or I'm changing some CRM system. The cyber one is really more about just understanding the impact that those things have with the business, and understanding if there's a big impact, how does that affect me? How does it affect my job? How does it affect our clients? How does it affect our patients? Whatever it is, they have to understand the holistic impact that something like that of that nature could cause. And that's why it's so important to us as an organization. When you're talking about other technology changes, it's all about their value equation within the organization. So it's who do they see themselves? What's their identity? And a lot of the times that's the tasks I'm doing and not the result I'm getting. And so when somebody is focused on the tasks and you try to change the system they're using, they think they're going to be poor at what they do because they don't know it. They don't know the tasks. But if you can let them know that a part of your identity in the company is this result, and here's a better system to get you to that result, then they can identify with that new system, and there's usually better adoption.
Yeah, no, that's great. When you think about just broadly, where do you think the biggest opportunities are besides training and education that organizations should be thinking about?
From a cyber standpoint, I think where we're going, where I'm hoping that we end up, is really looking at this thing called zero trust. There's a shift that's happened over the last number of years where, we used to protect the perimeter, and we used to say if nobody can get in, we're safe. That's just not the case anymore. You actually have to protect. You have to assume they're already in. And when you assume they're already in, now your individual station, individual person, your endpoint now has to trust nobody. So I am not going to trust anybody, any application, anything, unless it explicitly tells me I can. And that's the way in which I'm going to communicate now. So that's where I think we're going. That's where I hope we go, because it's a much more secure environment for what we're seeing today in the cyber community from a attack standpoint. So we're pushing on it. We're getting our people to it. We're training on it, just what that means, because it's a different mindset from the old way to protect from the perimeter.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a hot trend. For the most complex organization, it is a big challenge to get there, especially those that run hundreds of applications with thousands of users. To your point, it is a journey, but one that I think will pay dividends, especially as we have the rise of AI agents, which would be an identity in that ecosystem of zero trust as well. So that's a good insight. As we're starting to wrap up, what other areas that did we not talk about, or areas of interest of yours that you want to talk through?
Well, I mean, I think just everybody, has to keep the focus on cyber. For some reason, I feel like the conversation over the last year or so has shrunk. Even though the attacks are going up, and even though there's this crazy, economy out there that's, hundreds of billions of dollars based upon these attacks, it seems like we've let off the gas a little bit from a cyber standpoint. And I just want to reiterate that it is as big of a threat now as it ever has been. We are lacking any federal regulations for foreign entities to come in and do these attacks. There's no way to follow up. There's no way to get them right now. So the gas needs to be done. We need to push back on that pedal again, and we need to get the right tools in place and focus on training and get people trained. 80% of the issues are still people, right? So no matter how much you can get in your environment, which is to protect and rebuild if there's a problem, you still have to shut the vector down, and you got to educate people. So if anyone could focus on those, I think that you can make progress leaps and bounds.
I think that's really great advice, and I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and the recommendations you've had today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. This is Dan Dodson on Cyber Survival.